And policy briefs are an important instrument for us to bring across our research results in a very condensed matter and to inform and give out opinions about single policy issues. The goal of this webcast is to give you an idea of how to write a policy brief, and we'll therefore cover four questions. First of all, what is a policy brief? Second of all, what should a policy brief do? I mentioned a little bit of that briefly already earlier. Third, what should a policy brief look like? And fourth, how do I actually write a policy brief? I would like to underline the fact that a policy brief is a little bit like an elevator pitch, which means that you have about the time of an elevator ride to convince someone of your policy idea. A policy brief is a very short paper of 2 to 3 pages, so that you really have to focus on one single topic that you would like to deal with in this paper. And I think it's also important to keep in mind that a policy brief is a very different kind of text than other assignments that students usually have to complete during their studies. Because while academic papers are analyzing past developments, policy briefs are there to deduct recommendations for the future based on an informed analysis of the present in a specific policy area. For this webcast, I would like to use an example, namely a policy brief that I'm currently writing with a colleague of mine from Romania, and which is dealing with policy recommendations for a reform of the Eastern Partnership, a policy that is dealing with the relationship of the EU with the countries of Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan and Belarus, and where after the Riga summit we are giving some recommendations on how the Eastern Partnership could be reformed based on the assumption that can be derived from the Riga summit that in fact there is not at the moment a perspective for membership for countries like Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova who have already signed an association agreement. So I will refer back to this example from time to time. The first question, what is a policy brief? The idea is that it should provide enough background for the reader to understand the problem that you are dealing with, but it should not refer back to academic theories or theoretical assumptions. It should not explain the obvious. You have in a policy brief to convince the reader that the problem that you are dealing with in your paper has to be addressed urgently, so that it's a timely topic that has to be dealt with now, and not something that you think in general should be done. The policy brief can either provide alternatives, so say that either it would be good to change the policy concerning the countries Ukraine, Moldova and Georgia and give them a membership perspective after all, and then lobby for this idea towards the governments of those member states of the EU that are currently not supporting this. Or if you assume that this is not a path that you want to take, or a path that is very likely to be successful, then you can choose to give evidence to support one alternative, namely in our case the fact that we think that a membership perspective is not only something that can find a majority in the EU currently, but also maybe not the ideal instrument to support these countries in their transformation process. Finally, a policy brief should stimulate the reader to make a decision. So based on the fact that he realizes that this topic is very urgent, and that there are specific options on which way to go in the future path, he should make a decision and use, in the ideal case, your information and your position in his policy making. It should very quickly come to the point of what is the issue that is at stake, in your opinion, in this policy area. A policy brief should be written with a target audience in mind. This can be several or only one target audience. In the case of our paper on the Eastern Partnership, our main target is the European External Action Service, who is reforming the policy at the moment. So this is also a timely policy brief. But in a second level, so secondarily, it's also targeted towards the Ukrainian Moldovan or Georgian government who are aspiring for membership and who should be, with our paper, convinced that what we are proposing the EU is offering them is actually more useful to them at the moment. The whole policy brief should be built up so that you ultimately have a logical situation where you are giving, based on the informed analysis that you have done of the situation, based on the realistic approach on what is feasible at the time, you should give policy recommendations, which should be realistic and implementable, let's put it this way. That's not to say that they couldn't also sometimes be visionary and not only short-term recommendations. They can also be more long-term recommendations for the future that is a little bit further away. Sitting down and writing a policy brief. How do I write this policy brief? First of all, if you have already studied the topic that you would like to write a policy brief on, this can be very helpful because you already have a solid knowledge base on the topic that you are dealing with. Second of all, it helps to have a strong opinion because this means that you are able to bring forward your argument. But from the structure of a policy brief, it is obviously important to have the title, an introduction of the topic and its relevance, an analysis of the current situation, conclusions to this analysis, and finally, recommendations that you want to give. To achieve its objectives, a policy brief should be short and to the point. It should be based on firm evidence and not lofty assumptions. It should focus on meanings, not on methods, so not on theory, but on actual policy activities. But it should also relate to the big picture, so it should not be unrealistic in terms of the bigger picture of policy making, of decision making within the EU in this case. So based on this structure of how do I write a policy brief, it is also an important question to ask yourself, what are suitable topics for a policy brief? And I don't mean only for an assignment, but also in general. First of all, it is important to have a current reference to a topic. Even if you're an expert on a specific area and you have a very strong opinion on the topic, it is easier for you to reach your target audience if the topic is already on the agenda. For example, due to elections in a country, if you're writing a paper on Lebanon, which is maybe not such a strong topic in Germany, for example, it helps to publish it around elections in that country because that means that the topic is a little bit more on the agenda also in your target audience. Other possible events that you can relate your policy brief to are summits like the Riga summit, where you can either make recommendations beforehand, which can then feed into the debate at a summit, but also anniversaries, for example, 50 years of German-Israeli relations that we are celebrating this year. Concerning the recommendations that have already been mentioned several times, these are the most important and sometimes also the most difficult part. So when writing the recommendations, it's important to clearly identify which options will be recommended and which options will be discounted in the case if you give alternative developments. It is important to clearly lay out the argument for why that option is better than each of the others and why your options are ideal to improve the policy. This, of course, again, is based on your assumptions on how a policy should look. So, and how you want relationships, for example, with the Eastern Partnership countries to develop, which also enables the reader of your paper to see if they are coming from the same starting point and have similar assumptions, or whether they will, in that case, discard your argument because they have different underlying assumptions on how the policy should be shaped. The recommendations should be as detailed as possible. They can even go down to a very micro level on how this implementation can work, on how specific working groups could be implemented. For example, we are suggesting that the countries that are currently implementing the association agreements meet in working groups of the government offices that are relevant and important for this implementation, and that they can do an exchange of their best practices. So it's not a very general recommendation on the policy should be improved, for example. This is obvious. That's why I'm writing the policy brief and that's why I'm giving out recommendations. It is ideal if the recommendations also give specific steps on how this change can be brought about and when would be a suitable time to do so. So if you have written a policy brief and you have based it on an informed analysis of the current situation and you have shown that your arguments take into consideration the restrictions that might have an influence on the policy that you are dealing with, this is how you can convince a politician of your informed position on any given policy area that you would like. This is how you can convince a politician of your informed position on any given policy area that you would like. Thank you very much for your attention. The Ukraine currently has no membership perspective for the EU. Therefore, I think we should improve the Eastern Partnership policy. It should really support the countries Ukraine, Georgia and Moldova in implementing the association agreements and the DCFTAs. It should give them more information about how to improve their policies against corruption, how to implement the technical standards that they need for the EU, and how to learn from the EU's best practice examples in working groups. Thank you very much for your attention.